Here we are. All right. Welcome today. My name is Shanda Adams. I'm with the Training Officers Consortium, and I am a board member, and I also serve as our Annual Institute Program Chair this year. All right. Heather is, I would love to introduce Heather Murphy-Capsch. She is an instructor at Graduate School USA. She teaches writing, editing, proofreading, English grammar, and briefing technique classes for both Leadership Certificate program and the Communications and Professional Skills Department. She's been with the Graduate School for 17 years. I'll go ahead and give you the floor, Heather.
Thank you, Shanda. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you today, coming from Northern Virginia, where we have a wind advisory, but no snow. Since I was raised in Minnesota, I'm actually a little sad about the fact that we don't have snow, but I know it was snowing in Minnesota just a few days ago, so you guys are probably over it by now. I have had a dual track career my whole life. I've been teaching since I finished college. I went to an all-women's college and then went straight to East Africa to teach English in an all-boys high school. It's so true, the cliche about how the students teach the teacher more. My students definitely taught more than I taught them. And one of the things I learned from them was that I love teaching. Another thing I learned from them is that I'm a storyteller and a writer. And so I came back to the United States after I finished my tour in Kenya and got a master's in journalism and spent the next 15 years with a career that was mostly television news and also continued to teach from the high school all the way through the university level. So I kind of joke about it, but it's also kind of true that the things I know how to do and have degrees to do are to talk and to write. And so that's what I teach everybody. I married into the Army, HUA, and so when my husband and I started building a family, I decided it was time to stop getting deployed myself and start focusing on teaching. And that's what I do with a specific focus on plain language. And that's what brings me here to talk to all of you today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I want to just make sure, because I know there were some issues there, that everybody can see. So could I get some feedback here about whether everyone can see this? I'm seeing some thumbs up.
We gotcha. We can see your agenda.
Good news. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get going. And if it turns out that there is something crucial that's getting covered by a box, a strange box, we'll figure out what to do with that in the moment. But in the meantime, I am excited to get started and start talking about one of my favorite subjects, plain writing. It is the 21st century standard for government writing, so it really is a crucial part of what many of your competencies are all about as you grow your careers as federal workers. We're going to talk specifically today about what that really means, why it matters, not just to you individually, but really to the future of the federal workforce. So our agenda, as we've been discussing, is here. We're going to talk about what plain writing is. We'll define our terms. We'll talk about the Plain Writing Act of 2010. And we're also going to talk about some real sort of nuts and bolts, how to use the federal plain language guidelines that shape the actual act of writing in plain language. And then finally, we will open things up to questions. As Shanda noted, we're asking you to hold your questions to the end, please. And then between Shanda and Amy, we will make sure that we get to as many questions as we possibly can. If you'll just put those in the Q&A section, that will be great. We will be using the chat at one point or your reactions just for a little bit of back and forth. But for the questions, if you'll just load those into the Q&A, and we'll get to them as we go. So let's begin by just beginning to talk about what plain language is. And as I do that, I want to make sure that I'm clear that the terms plain writing refer to, again, like I said, the 21st century standard of government writing, which is a real shift. It is a style shift, and it is a culture shift in writing. An unfortunate hallmark of previous styles of government writing is that it's clunky and wordy and circuitous. And so using plain language and evolving to use plain language is a deliberate, intentional effort to clean up that clunkiness from government writing, which makes you ultimately a more efficient and effective communicator. So just a quick note that when I say plain writing, or if I say plain language or plain English, I'm talking about all the same thing. Those are three phrases that all mean plain English, plain language. It simply refers to conversational, uncomplicated writing, not informal, just uncomplicated. So let's talk more about what plain writing actually means. It means that it is writing that your reader can get immediately as soon as they are reading your document. They don't have to reread it a couple of times just to figure out what you're saying. By the way, I do want to note that the material on these slides and these definitions here do come from the plainwriting.gov website. So this is all sourced from the Plain Writing website that backs up the Plain Writing Act of 2010. And I will be showing you that website later on. So plain writing is clear, it's concise, it's conversational. If you think about the way you talk to each other over a Teams meeting or on the phone, or across a conference room from each other. That's what plain writing is all about. It's just conversational, professional English. So we dig in deeper, a little bit deeper here into our definition of plain language. And what we know is that within the different levels of expertise in the government, within the different topics that make our business of what we do in the federal government, there are different levels of expertise and quite a bit of subject complexity. So it does make a difference when you are communicating with people within your agency or outside, that you need to take time to assess what your readers know and what they will be able to understand quickly. So part of the concept of being conversational has to do with paying close attention to who you're having your conversation with. Who are you writing for? What they know, what language, so to speak, of expertise they're speaking matters a lot for your definition of what conversational business English is about. It's going to be very different when you're talking to a broad general audience versus when you're talking to a smaller matter of subject experts. That's what we mean by conversational. Readers are always looking for utility in what they read. They want to be able to get their answers quickly. They want to use what they read to fit their needs or to do what it is that you're asking them to do or know what you need them to know. So I want to pause a moment. This is where I get to ask you to use the chat and ask all of you to tell me, or actually not so much the chat, but give me a reaction in your windows, and I'm going to put one in mine. Anyone who is familiar with the Plain Writing Act of 2010, if you can give me a thumbs up, or I've got a couple thumbs, I got a lot of thumbs up. Good. Okay. I've got a few surprised faces. All right, but I've got a lot of thumbs up and a heart there. Oh, love the heart. Excellent. Okay. All right, good, good. So thank you everybody for weighing in on whether you're familiar with the Plain Writing Act of 2010. I'm delighted to see that there were lots of thumbs up. I'm also not surprised to see that there were those who don't know about it. It's been around obviously for a little while now, but it's one of those things that's sort of slow to get out there. The news has been slow. We do teach plain language at the graduate school in all of our writing courses, and it is federal law, but it's, not quite as jazzy as some of the other federal laws out there. So it's taking its time. But that's why we do things like this, to get more people in on the news of the Plain Writing Act. So as I begin the discussion of the Plain Writing Act itself, what I get an opportunity to tell you is that the concept of plain writing or plain English is not new. It did not just happen in 2010. It's actually been around for 100 years. That's no exaggeration. Any of you who used Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, that handy little style book that's been around for a long time, you got an introduction to plain writing back when you used that book in school. It was the main phrase in that book that most people remember is eliminate dead wood. That is a plain writing concept, and the entire book is actually all about plain writing. The law itself, the Plain Writing Act of 2010, simply states that the definition of plain language, as we discussed earlier, is this style of writing that is mandated for those who write on behalf of the federal government. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. How did we get to the point where we went from having a style book in your English class to having an actual federal law? It actually begins a little bit with President Nixon, but really starts to gather steam in the 70s, late 70s with President Jimmy Carter. President Jimmy Carter ordered government workers to have better customer service, better customer response by writing clearer and easier to understand documents. Again, in the 90s, President Bill Clinton does similar things with presidential memorandums saying you've got to have simpler, easier to understand language so that the customer can understand what they need to do or what they're eligible for. In spite of this sequential action from Nixon all the way to Clinton, the concept of plain language continues to get pretty strong cultural pushback within the culture of government writing. It's really hard to convince people that professional conversational English really is a good government standard because it's so entrenched. The old style of government writing that is so hyper formal and so wordy, people would say to me, even when I used to teach these classes before the Plain Writing Act of 2010, I would have students who would say, well, this is clearly better communication. It's clearer, it's easier to understand, but that's not the government style. So it was always an interesting sort of disconnect there because I would be hired by senior leadership to come teach plain language, but then I would be told by those who were, boots on the ground, really doing the writing that, oh, this isn't government style. We can't do it that way. So in a very clear effort to get rid of that disconnect in 2010, we get the Plain Writing Act of 2010 that says this is now a federal mandate. We want government writing to be conversational and to be simpler, not slang, but simpler. So I want to tell you a little bit more about that, but I always like to give you this example here to talk about how long it has been that federal leaders have been interested in trying to get plain language as a standard for government writing. So what you've got on the screen here is an excerpt from a letter written by the Director of Civilian Defense, John Landis, to the Federal Works Agency. This is in 1942. So this is an excerpt from that letter, and I want to set the scene for you. What you've got here is President Roosevelt, president during World War II, in the press room talking to members of the press and reading this letter out loud to them. Now, I did not include that back and forth conversation on the slide just because it's just too much for a slide. So I'm going to tell you that what happens as the president is reading this letter out loud to the press, they're laughing back and forth and having this joke. So he's saying, and I'll read a little bit of it now. Such preparation shall be made as will completely obscure all federal buildings and non-federal buildings occupied by the federal government during an air raid. You've got people sort of laughing at this point. And it's not funny. This is not funny stuff. An air raid, I mean, we're in the middle of a war, right? But the letter is so wordy. He goes on, for any period of time from visibility by reason of internal or external illumination. At this point, he breaks off and laughs. He says, I've seen some of you illuminated sometimes, and the press laughs back, and he talks about being illuminated. And he gets through the whole thing, and the joke, again, it's not a funny topic, but the letter has become the butt of a joke because it's so wordy and hard to understand. And by the time he gets to the end of it, he turns to his press secretary, a guy named Steve Early, and he says, "Rewrite that for me, will you? Just tell him the buildings have to keep their work going. Put something across the windows." This is a brilliant example of a senior leader, the most senior leader, saying, hey, this communication would be more effective if you just put it in conversational English so that people could use it and understand it quickly. So we get to the Plain Writing Act of 2010, and the guts of it are right here. The section 2, the purpose for the act. And this is the essence of what we're trying to do. We're trying to be a more accountable and transparent government, because when our communication is understandable and usable, we are meeting our mission, which is to serve the taxpayers of the United States. So I do want to note that the act actually specifically does refer to writing that is intended for members of the public. But I also want to note, for anybody who's thinking, oh, well, I'm good to go. I can keep writing the way I want to because I don't write for members of the public. If all of my writing is internal, then maybe I don't have to think about this. And this is where I say, actually, not so much, because even though the language of the law is specific to mandating communication to the public, the intent of the law really is to spell out that this is the 21st century standard of government writing. Everyone needs to use it. We have research that shows that people understand and process communication better when it is conversational. We have trends within the overall business culture that say plain language is the more efficient, effective way to go to make you a more efficient and effective communicator. So I'm going to pause again here and talk about plain writing and the future of the federal workforce. And before I do that, before we talk a little bit more about why plain writing matters, I'm just curious to ask all of you about what you think are some characteristics of the federal workforce, the future federal workforce. And what I mean by that is words like collaborative. I'll throw collaborative out there, and I'm not going to put my chat box up to type that in because I'm worried about blocking things. But I'm going to ask all of you if you'll think about it for a second, reflect, and put into the chat some of the descriptive words that will illustrate what the future federal workforce should look like or does look like. They have to be collaborative. What else do they have to be? And I'll ask Shanda and Amy to help me with what comes into the chat.
Oh, goodness, they're coming by awful fast. I see transparent, creative, self-aware, efficient, specialist, diverse, working together, collaborative, efficient, gracious, clear, understandable, efficient, flexible, adaptable, accurate, innovative, flexible, open-minded. Lots of descriptors in there. Accountable, progressive, digestible, agile.
I love it. Those are great. Oh, I hope we can capture some of that because I'd like to put that in a slide for the future. You guys are awesome. So
they're still coming in.
Okay. All right. Well, let's keep seeing what we come by, and I've put a few more here. The future federal workforce has to be technologically sophisticated. They have to have situational agility. I heard some words that implied that same thing. Adaptable, multi-generational. They have to be collaborative. I heard creative thinkers. I heard innovators. I heard people who are, did somebody say something about teams? I thought I heard us say something with teams. Good critical thinkers as well. Anything else pop up to throw out there, Shanda, before I move on?
Got diverse, accurate, and current, simplicity,
Correct.
Visual, teamwork, flexible,
Okay.
receptive
Right.
to input, culturally
Receptive to
competent,
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah. All
seamless,
right. Seamless.
concise,
Okay.
reader
Okay.
friendly.
I love it. I love it. So these are all wonderful descriptors of the future federal workforce. And with everything I heard, truly everything I heard, what I can say is there's a bright thread that connects all of those qualities together. And it's obvious and it's a crucial part of demonstrating your skill in many of your competencies. It's clear, complete communication. It's all about communication. We call it a soft skill. I know that there's a reference to things like writing and editing and giving presentations and briefs as soft skills, but in fact, it is the one skill that everything else relies on in order to actually work. So let's talk a little bit about that. Plain language is what ensures that your communication is complete. It ensures that you decrease your misunderstandings and you meet your deadlines better and spend your money better. It is the underlier for many of the core competencies that all of you are trying to establish as you build your careers within the federal government. And those competencies are right here. The competencies that require good writing are both fundamental and executive. Obviously, fairly obvious, oral and written communication, but even within the executive competencies, we're talking about your skill as a communicator. Do your peers and your leadership understand what you're trying to tell them, what you're asking of them? Do they trust your skill as a communicator enough to be led through things like conflict management and team building? Do your customers understand what you're doing and what your mission and your products are and how you can help? This soft skill has an awfully hard result, and that is your increased competency at your job and as a federal worker and at your ability to build your career. So when we talk about how important it is, then we say, well, if it's that important, obviously I need to know how to do it. And so is there a book out there? Is there something we can do beyond this webinar? And the answer, fortunately, is yes. There is, in fact, a website. One of the many reasons it was so hard to get the culture of plain language to evolve within government was that it was very difficult to say, what is the standard? What are we calling plain language and where's the book on it? And so in 2010, when the Plain Language Act or Plain Writing Act was signed, government also partnered with Plain, the Plain Language Action Information Network, to create this resource, the Plain Language website. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a moment just so that I can flip over to share the Plain Language website with you. And you should now be seeing the home page for the plainlanguage.gov website, which is the repository for all things plain language. The URL is up there at the very top. And sorry, now I've just had a pop up on my screen. I'm gonna minimize, there we go. So plainlanguage.gov, I strongly urge you to bookmark this website and come to it and get familiar with it. And of course, I always recommend taking writing classes as well, because that's a great way to incorporate pretty organically the plain language, use of plain language within writing exercises. So the most important, all of this is important, but the most important part of this website is right here. If you look at the top dashboard, it's the Plain Language Guidelines. The Plain Language Guidelines are the rules for plain language. I click on that, and on the left-hand side, you'll see that each chapter in this book is each of these guidelines. Write for your audience, organize the information, and so on. So for the rest of our webinar together, I'm going to run through some of the highlights of each of these federal plain language guidelines and talk a little bit about what they mean and what they're telling you to do. But also, once again, encourage you to call up this URL on your own, bookmark it on your device, and make it one of your go-to resources as a writer. All right, going back now to my PowerPoint. So once again here, we've got the federal plain language guidelines. And as I mentioned, we're going to hit a few of the highlights of each of these guidelines, but there's much, much more. We begin with writing for your reader. And one of the things that I stress frequently when I'm talking about writing for your reader is the reminder that when we tell you to use conversational English, we really are saying, talk the way you talk to each other. It does not mean dumbing it down. I'm going to say that again. Plain language does not equal dumbing down. It does equal simplifying depending on who your reader is. You wouldn't use a vocabulary word that a reader doesn't know because that makes them not understand what you're talking about, and that's not clear communication. So figure out who your reader is and speak in a language that makes sense. The next guideline is organize your information. And one of the highlights of the organize the information guideline is to remind you that for clear communication, you need to place the main idea first. Material is just easier to follow if readers understand the main concept before they get to any of the exceptions and conditions. So here are some examples of what that looks like. Again, use the main idea first. And of course, because in English, there's always an exception to the rule. It's just one of the beauties of this language. We do say, if the exception is a long and cumbersome list, then do use the exception if it avoids getting through that long list. I'll give you examples. And again, these examples do come from the Federal Plain Language website and also from some of our own material that we use at the graduate school. Also, under organize the information, we encourage you to prefer concrete nouns to abstract nouns. So concrete nouns are things that you can actually experience through your senses. Sky, door, friend, house. It's something you can touch or smell or see versus abstract nouns that are hard to define. Love, happiness, freedom. That's not to say that those nouns don't have a place in our language. They absolutely do. But in professional business English, when you're talking about concepts that can already be complex within your various subjects, we encourage you to stick as much as you can with concrete nouns for simplicity and for the ability to explain yourself. Do prefer familiar words to the far-fetched. This is not the time to go to the thesaurus and look up fancy words. I think a lot of writers are motivated to show their depth and breadth at writing, their skill at writing. And obviously, as a writer myself, I understand that instinct, but I also understand that you can sometimes get in your own way by trying to use super fancy words and losing your reader. And that gives me a chance to throw up our first poll question to get a sense of what you got from those last things. So Shanda is going to put up a little poll. I guess we'll put that as much as we can to the right here, Shanda. And we've got two questions here, A and B, two versions, I should say, of the same sentence. And the question is, which organizes information best? The sentence in choice A or the sentence in choice B? Which of those organizes information best? I'll be quiet here for a moment, let you read it, and then answer the poll question.
So we had 66% participated, 645, or excuse me, 40% of those said A and 60% said B.
Okay, so 40% of you have the correct answer. The correct answer is A, and that is the answer that gives the main point first before you give the exception. So I will read out the correct answer. With your grant application, you must submit a resume containing your undergraduate, graduate, and any other professional education, your work experience in the field of healthcare, and the name and phone number of current and previous employers in the health field, unless you have already submitted this information. So the exception comes at the very end. And what we are told by the Organize Your Information Federal Plain Language guideline there is that we put the main idea first and round it out, if we have to, with exceptions. So answer B begins with the exception, unless you have already submitted. That is why answer B is not correct. All right, I'm going to move on. Reminder that if you have questions, follow up to that, or anything else, please feel free to stick it in the Q&A, and we are going to get to those questions at the end of this presentation. So the next guideline tells us to choose our words carefully, and among those, among the details of that particular guideline are to prefer the single word to the circumlocution and to prefer the short word to the long. So circumlocution, what does that mean? It's just a long way of saying something. Those of you who are familiar with the old Harry Potter series, instead of saying Lord Voldemort, we say he who must not be named. That is a circumlocution. When we are referring to people like me, we say women of a certain age, and that is a circumlocution. One that I see frequently in business writing is on a daily basis instead of daily. We don't need that circumlocution. It means the same thing. When you say on a daily basis, you're cluttering up your language. The phrase came about with an effort to make sure that government writing was formal enough. But unfortunately, we went too far. And so circumlocutions litter our writing. They make it clunky, they make it wordy, and they don't do us any favors in terms of transparency, authenticity, or even believability. Because you know as well as I do, when you read something that's overwritten, you lose faith in the writer. And we're encouraging you to keep the faith of your reader by writing simply and clearly and reliably. Keep tenses simple is another detail within that guideline. Whoops, we've got the same thing here, sorry. And also keeping it conversational. We encourage you to keep your tenses simple within that keep it conversational guideline. And what that means is that you can say most of what you need to say in government writing by using simple present, past, future. Government writing gets a little happy with tense. They say things like have been doing and will have been done. Those tenses are absolutely legit tenses in the English language. We need present perfect. We need past progressive. We need them for shadings in meaning. But with the majority of your communication, you don't need that kind of shading. Most of the stuff you're talking about is simply happening now, or it is finished and happened in the past, or is going to happen in the future. You really can rely on those simple tenses. Another piece of keeping it conversational is all about using contractions. And I know some of you feel like, oh, my head's going to explode because I was taught never, ever, ever use contractions. It's too informal. It's not the way we write. And the answer is It actually is the way we talk. We use a blend of contractions and the spelled out version in daily conversation. And so what we're saying is it's okay to transfer that natural blend to your writing. Is there such thing as a document where maybe a contraction is just a little too conversational? Sure. If you're responding to a congressional inquiry, if you're writing a letter to the White House, then I would say, okay, I'm with you on that. Let's keep the contractions to a minimum. But pretty much anything else, certainly day-to-day communication within email, whether it's internal or external, a few contractions here and there lend to your authenticity as a writer because it's the way we talk. It's easier to process and it's easier to understand when it's conversational. So now, within the concept of conversational English, we get a chance to get to the subject that most people love to hate and love to love as well. And it's all about the active voice versus the passive voice. A zombie ate my brain was eaten by a zombie. When you ask people what the passive voice is, lots of times what you get is, oh, well, it's a sentence where not much is going on, or it's a sentence where there's a verb that doesn't really have a lot of action in it, or there's, they're referring to something that we don't really know about. There's a lot of answers that sort of circle around but never quite actually define. And so for this webinar, I'm actually going to take a moment to show you a quick video that more clearly defines the active voice and encourage you, all of you as writers, to start paying close attention to whether you see any evidence of the passive voice in your own writing. Sometimes it crops up and we don't even know it's there. It is not a more formal way of writing. That has often been the culture of explanation for why we use the passive voice, but it's an urban myth. It's not more formal. It never has been. It just somehow came to be understood that way, and it was hard to convince everybody that there was really no rule that said do this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen again for a moment so that I can get you the video. All right. All right, stopping there for a quick sound check. Are we hearing and seeing me?
Yeah, if you could, yep, there you go. If we're good.
All right, let's do it.
Introducing Passive Voice Hits. If you love being passive, this 20-disc set can be enjoyed by you. Included in this exclusive collection is Whitney Houston's classic, You Will Always Be Loved by Me. Eric Clapton's The Sheriff Was Shot by Me, but the deputy was not shot by me. And the late great Marvin Gaye's It Was Heard by Me Through the Grapevine. Order today.
Wow, those songs aren't so catchy in passive voice. What's passive voice, you ask? Well, passive voice is when the subject of your sentence appears after the verb or not at all. Passive voice is wordy and vague. It hides who or what is doing the action in your sentence. And it makes your readers work harder to identify the subject of your sentence. To encourage transparency, we should avoid using passive voice and instead use active voice. Active voice focuses on the subject, making it clear who is doing what. It leaves little room for interpretation. Let's compare two sentences. The passive voice sentence, the form must be completed electronically, is vague. Who should complete it? You? Your attorney? Only people named Bob? Hi, Bob. The active voice sentence, you must complete the form electronically, is clear and direct. You can substitute any subject and it's still clear. How about the applicant, homeowners, taxpayers? Active voice gives your reader a clear message, so when you are writing any type of document, avoid using passive voice. You can tell your colleagues you heard this tip through the grapevine.
All right. fun video. Bear with me here while I get back to you. So that video, by the way, was produced by the U.S. Customs Service. You can find it on your plain language website under training. So I encourage you to go in and actually take a look at those training videos that they have, because there's quite a lot of really good stuff there. And just go to the plainlanguage.gov website, go to the tab that says training, and you got a huge menu of training videos that will talk about all manner of things. So now, this is what we just saw, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And again, you can navigate to that from plain language. My slide says .com, it's .gov. All right, our next poll question is here. And that is 2 different exercises here where we choose which of the sentences is active voice. And I'll read it out loud just in case we're still having this box problem. So the first one, letter A, we've got 2 choices. Number 1, bonds will be withheld in cases of non-compliance with all permits and conditions. Or number 2, we will withhold your bond if you don't comply with all permit terms and conditions. And B, number 1, the following information must be included in the application for it to be considered complete. Or number 2, you must include the following information in your application. So for both A and B, please choose the active voice sentence.
So I have poll 2A up right now. So they're answering the first one, either 1 or 2. For A, we had 85% choose 2. So to B, 1 or 2. So to B, number 2 also was the favorite for our polling.
All right, well done, everybody. I'm so happy to see these results. This is fantastic. You're all rock stars. So you're the majority of you got this right with poll question 2 in section A. We will withhold your bond. Question 2 is in the active voice. The subject comes before the verb. Withhold is the verb. Who is withholding? We are. The subject of your sentence is the thing that's doing the verb. So we, the subject, comes before the verb. Active voice number 2. With section B, again, number 2, you must include subject before verb. Include is the verb. Who's doing the including? You are. Again, the subject of your sentence is the thing that is doing the verb. So you are the one doing the including. And I stress what I love so much about that video is that it makes it very clear that the definition of the active voice really is all about word order. It's not about the sense of the sentence. It's not about whether there's action going on or authority to be what's being told or any kind of mood or vibe or whether the moon is full. It is really all about, does the subject come before the verb? Subject before verb equals active voice. Okay, thank you, everybody. So a few more notes here. Designing for reading is a big one. We know that readers lose track easily. We are all distracted readers. We've got phones and laptops and everything is just constantly going off. We've always been distracted. It just got worse. It's not like we were really, really good before and then all of a sudden the iPhone happened and it all fell apart. We were actually already pretty distracted, but the iPhone definitely made it worse, or the Samsung or whatever. I'll take aim at all of them. So you, as a writer, are aiming to try to punch through some of the noise that is going on in your reader's head, all the different things that they're balancing, all the balls in the air. And part of your job is literally just to make it look readable. And to do that, you make sure that you use lists and headings. Headings help readers organize by subject. Lists make it easier for them to read and process information and use plenty of white space. In the example I have here on the slide, you don't even have to read it to see that the right-hand side is just easier. Your eyes will naturally gravitate that way because you can see, oh, I can process this faster than if I have to look at that long, clunky, wordy paragraph. A little bit more about lists. It's crucial, in fact, in today's writing that we rely on the list because it allows us to, if we number our lists, it allows us to tell readers what's the most important. We can rank things 1, 2, 3. We can help people understand the order in which they happen. And if we're just using bullets, we can help people just skim and scan. We always use lots of white space, again, to help the eye take a break and not get so exhausted by so many words. It's not to say that you are going to use fewer words overall, but you're going to change the way you present those words, and making that readable is all the difference between connecting with your reader and making your documents usable. And that, of course, is the end goal, making your documents usable. Okay, one last poll question. We've got 3 statements here, and we're asking you to choose which of these statements is true, a true description of plain writing. And I will read it out loud. The first bullet says, plain writing means simplifying your writing to an 8th grade level so that everyone can understand it. The second bullet says plain writing means writing in an appropriately formal voice. And bullet number 3 says plain writing means writing that your audience can understand the first time they read it. So if you will please choose which of those bullets best describes plain writing.
We have about 63% answered. Still answers coming in.
Okay.
All right. We're about at 74%.
Okay, what do we have?
All right, let me show those results.
All right, and we are looking at 94% of those of you who answered said the last one, and that is correct. Plain writing means writing that your audience can understand the first time they read it. I love these reactions when they come in. The party confetti horns, the hearts, the clapping. I'm going to clap along with you. Yay! All right. So yes, plain writing is, the definition of plain writing is writing that your audience can understand the first time they read it. They can use what they find, and they can find what they need. All right. So that brings us just about to the end of the content that I have to present to you before we open it up to Q&A. But before we get to the Q&A, I do want to note again, I mentioned it earlier, I'm going to mention again, that our writing classes at the graduate school are all based on plain writing. So each one of these classes uses the federal plain language guidelines in terms of the way we guide the exercises you do, and in terms of the actual exercises that are part of the content itself, part of the classes. And we do look at that website again, walking through those guidelines a little bit more. So if this is of interest to you, if you like the idea of studying the craft of writing and how you can be a better plain writer in exercises about writing, consider any of these classes that we have here. I note that we also base all of our classes on the government style guide, the GPO style guide, which is kind of the mothership of all style guides. The agencies all have their own supplemental style guides, but they're all based on GPO. So the two foundational documents that govern your style as a writer are the Federal Plain Language Guidelines and the GPO Style Guide, and that's what our courses are also based on. Okay, and so with that, let me open it up to questions. And I guess, Shanda, I can stop sharing my screen here and just look and see what the questions are. I don't think anybody needs to see the slide.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We do have some questions. Are you able to open the Q&A, or would you like for us to read the Q&A for you?
If you would read the Q&A for me, that would be helpful for me, so I can try to keep track of what I'm saying and reading at the same time.
All right. So Angela has written, how do you see the plain writing and accessibility mandates supporting each other?
I think that in terms of the accessibility mandate, what we're talking about is ensuring that language is put in places. If I'm understanding your question correctly, you're talking about things like alt text, which is simple conversation that, or simple language that describes what is being seen or being heard for communities that need supports in that. And plain language is the kind of language that plugs in those accessibility modules, if I understood your question correctly.
Okay. And then there was an interesting question on, is there a standard style of writing dates? March 14th, 2023, the numbers 3/ or 14 March 2023.
So definitely not the last one. That one is European, and we do put our month before our date. That is actually more of a style guide question than a plain language question. And I would want to double check myself on this, but I'm fairly certain that the GPO style guide tells you to do March and then the date, and then and March 14th, 2023, for example, in your correspondence. Is there also a function for being able to use it? The dash, probably, but again, I want to check on the style guide. It's not a plain language thing. And I tell my students this all the time, by the way. One of the beauties of what I do is that a lot of answers I have on tap because I talk about it all day, every day. And then every now and then you throw something at me that I think, well, I think I know the answer, but I better go to the resource to confirm. So I would recommend going to that GPO style guide to confirm it, but I think what I said is correct. Write out the month, then the day and the comma and the year, and then alternatively it would be the numbers with the hyphen.
So here's a yes/no question, but you can expand upon it. Is plain language required for legislation?
Not legally, no, which is one of the wonderful ironies, is that we have this federal mandate, but legislation is not covered under that mandate. It should be.
And here's another yes or no that I see in the chat. Have you used the Visible Thread resource in centerforplainlanguage.org?
I have not. Oh, there's my cat. Sorry.
Cat has.
Literally 1,000 years old. She's a little lost. I don't know Visible Thread, and I'm writing it down now, so this is interesting to me. I will look that up. Thank you. Just can I follow up with the asker? What is it that you love about Visible Thread? Can you share with all of us?
And I'll watch for that coming through the chat. In the meantime, question, can you revisit the appropriate time, place to use plain language? I hear no congressional inquiry, no letter to White House, but what about a published report or study?
So let me clarify. I was talking specifically about contractions in an inquiry or in a letter. So plain language in an inquiry is fine because we are talking about professional language. You're never going to use slang in anything other than, when you're chatting back and forth with a colleague over the water cooler, old-fashioned water cooler. But it's specifically contractions. I said that would be something where in a congressional inquiry or in a White House letter, maybe I'd stay away from them, but do please use plain language in all of it.
And just as an aside, your kitty cat has perked the ears of some dogs that are listening in online. So just to let you know.
Sorry about that. I think Shanda, she made a visit when you and I were meeting before. So by way of explanation to everybody, this cat is really, really old and she's senile. And so sometimes she comes in and really needs my attention. I think I'm just going to grab her and put her on my lap so that
Yes,
she
we're having requests to see the cat. There you
Okay,
go.
here we go. Here's the cat. This is
Oh,
Fuzzy Lou Who.
Fuzzy Lou Who, very adorable.
She helped me survive the days when my husband was deployed downrange in Kandahar. That's how long she's been around.
All right, let's go back to a question here. My office has very serious arguments about the Oxford comma. Does plainlanguage.org cover this issue?
No, but your GPO style guide does. And here's the answer to that question. GPO style guide says, yes, use the Oxford comma. So there is a definitive answer on it. It comes from your mothership style guide. Yes, I know you see it without, see lists all the time in newspapers and magazines without the Oxford comma, and that's because the AP style guide and the New York Times style guide, my brethrens in the journalism world, do not use the Oxford comma. So in most of the news you see, it's not there. When you write in the voice of the government, you use the Oxford comma.
Very nice. I have a couple of questions that are similar, so I'm going to sum it up with this question. Sometimes using, and I'm air quoting you, makes it appear like the writer's pointing a finger at the addressee. What do you recommend?
Terrific point, and I love that you said that. That actually is addressed in the federal plain language guidelines. The federal plain language guidelines do encourage you to use personal pronouns, especially in things like FAQs. Instead of saying this agency, just say we, unless, and that's a critical exception there, it comes across like you are finger pointing. If you're saying things like, well, you did not complete your application for this policy on time, in this case you do not use it because of exactly what you said, that it does sound finger pointy and you are trying to get along. So we avoid it in those cases.
All right, and here's one that is maybe for, you can definitely answer this. Does the graduate school have any certifications in plain writing explicitly?
No, we do not have specific plain writing certification. You do become certified in plain writing when you get your CPEs for the courses we take, however. So it is not only for plain writing, but you get a CPE and that does certify you.
Great. And there was a few questions about the courses here with GSUSA. How do you feel about word count requirements?
Believe it or not, I actually really like word count requirements because they force you to be economical with your language. I know they're frustrating, and I know you can feel as though you're not being allowed to express the fullness of what you're trying to say. I think we have all learned, for better or for worse, with Twitter, that you can get the word count down, and actually they do you a favor, especially if you are naturally a verbose person.
Here's one on any thoughts on Chat GPT?
Yes, I have thoughts on them, but I will be very brief about it because I want to make sure that we stay focused on answering questions specifically about plain language. But I'm old school. I don't love it. I don't think there's a place for using it. And I think that we have proven already from editors, book editors who have received book submissions written entirely by Chat GPT, that the writing is ultimately not very good and loses all nuance and expertise. So, it's a fun thing. It certainly has been a fun cocktail party conversation, but it does not replace real humans. And I'll stand by that.
There were a couple of questions that had Chat GPT in it, so I just picked one.
Okay.
Can plain language be grounded in or identified with certain school or grade level? Interesting.
So I think many of you have probably been told that you should try to maintain a certain grade level in your writing, anywhere between, some of you have been told between 2 and 6, depending on your subject matter. Others have been told between 2 and 8. There is certainly a correlation between plain writing and grade level. That is, again, not to say that plain writing is all going to hit the same grade level. It really all, once again, comes back to what is your subject matter and who is your reader. If you are a rocket scientist and you're talking to another rocket scientist, then what you're talking about in language that each of you understands is going to score hot on any readability scale, probably 12th grade or higher. And I certainly am not going to understand it. But if you each understand that language, then it is plain language. You're paying attention to one of the mandates, which is write for your audience. Write in a way that can be understood, where your audience can understand it the first time they read it, use what they read, and find the information they need to do what you're asking them to do.
Great. I have another one here that is there use of non-binary language such as MX instead of MS, MR, or MRS?
There is no specific discussion of the non-binary pronouns in the plain language guidelines or in the GPO style guide, not this version of it. I don't honestly know when it's going to get revised. Last time the style guide was revised was in 2016. The guidelines do encourage you to pay attention to gender and to be inclusive when it comes to gender. And so what I usually say in my classes is it is incumbent on you, the writer, to be aware of pronouns and use the pronouns that people are asking for. And so even though there's no specific guidance on it, there is every responsibility on the part of the writer to write inclusively.
All righty. And then I do have someone asking, do you know anything about the Clear and Concise Content Act of 2022?
I do not. You surprised me. Okay.
All right.
Clear and concise. I'm writing it down. Content Act of 2022. You guys are awesome. That's 2. Visible Thread and Clear and Concise Content Act of 2022. I've got some homework ahead of me.
All right, let's see. This training has been very effective and clear. The principles apply to any writer across grades, position, etc. How do you engage employees who think because of their job class, they are already the best writer ever? I guess I'm asking about how do you help employees be open to good editing?
Great question. I think that part of that has to do with the way you present feedback, starting with what works. And the other piece of it has to do with asking for I'm going to say 2 things here, sort of battling with myself with which one to say first. I think that with employees that are resistant to transformational feedback, part of what needs to happen is greater group feedback, possibly in organic methods like a Google document rather than track changes kind of thing within a Google document. You can also explain what you're doing a little bit more than track changes. And I guess the last thing of it is when people are resistant to changing their perspective, what you can do is use the language of what we teach in our classes, the 7 traits of writing. And you can talk about whether the language of a document resonates with a reader. For example, am I clear about what you want from the reader? Is the main point clear? Am I understanding what you want from the reader? And ask recursive questions of your author to help them tease some of those things out. So if you're looking at a document where, for example, the main point is not clear, ask your writer, what is it that you want from your reader? And ask them to winnow that down to one sentence. And if that sentence is not in the first paragraph of the document or in the document at all, then that opens a door to talking about clarity of main points and focusing documents on main points. That's just one thing. You ask a good question, and the answer to it is probably an entire class on dealing with people who are resistant to getting feedback or changing their writing style. But I hope I've given you at least one small nugget to hang on to.
Great. And then I have one here in the chat. What is the difference between technical writing versus plain language writing?
The difference really is that even that technical writing is language of a specific expertise, and even technical writing can be plain. And so you say, well, how in the world is that possible if you've got this whole vocabulary? You can use the vocabulary within the context of plain language and use both technical writing and plain writing in the same document. So the vocabulary sits within the overall structure of plain language, which includes things like the contractions and the simpler words that are not specific to your vocabulary. Does that answer that question? I hope so.
If you'll put in the chat if that answered your question, that would be great.
Okay.
I did have one about an 80-20% rule that I'm looking for here. I've heard that 80% plain and 80% active and 20% passive is acceptable.
I disagree. I think that if there really is such thing as a reliable ratio like that, and I don't actually believe there's such thing as a reliable ratio like that, but if there is, it'd probably be more like 95% to 5%. Here's the thing. There is a reason for the passive voice. There is a time, there are times when passive voice will serve you. Most of the time, passive voice serves you when you literally don't know who is doing the action, then you have to use passive voice. Sometimes when the law is the actor, then you can use passive voice, but most of the time you can get around that. And I encourage writers to be disciplined about finding ways to get around it unless you really truly do meet the test. And that means testing yourself. Do I really need the passive voice? Do I really not know who's the actor in this sentence?
And then I have one here. Is there a good guide for writing? I'm so sorry. It just left. Is there a good guide for writing people who don't like to read charts, graphs, etc.?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, it's for how to avoid or how to give the information that is contained in a chart or graph instead of using those infographics.
Yes, thanks.
Okay. I probably the best workaround to things like that would be bulleted or numbered lists. I'll be honest with you, we do strongly recommend using those kinds of pictorial descriptions because you can use colors in a bar graph, because especially with infographics, they can be for a lot of readers easier to process than lots of words. But if you are dealing with a population of readers that does deal with words better than a chart or a graph, I would say lists. And then I would also say explore the possibility of infographics, pictures, rather than either a line graph or a bar graph or a pie chart. Think about whether you could find a way creatively to use infographics instead.
Okay. And we had one pop up that I thought was kind of interesting myself, but it's probably in the style guide. Periods, 1 space or 2?
1. One, I know, and that's just like with the contractions. Some of your heads are exploding, and you're saying to me, "Nope, nope, that's my limit. Not doing it." So here's the deal with the two spaces after the period. It comes from typewriter days. It comes from readability and spacing on typewriters. So when we were using the old IBM Selectrics, which I took to college with me, we did two spaces because it made it readable. That had everything to do, again, with type style and font and spacing on the page. Today, those spacings and those type styles are slightly different, and your word programs are spacing things in such a way that readability is not enhanced with the two spaces rule. And so, in fact, unless you override it, your word programs will give you just one space. You can override it, and I know that some people feel very strongly about overriding it. I almost always have at least one conversation about this in my writing classes. And your GPO style guide also says one space. So in service of standardizing your work product within the office, I recommend doing the one space. I also say if there's a difference between using active voice or using two spaces, I'm going to say go with the active voice. That should be the one habit you change overall. If you just can't change the habit of the two spaces, that would be the one where I'd say pick your battles. But really, if you can go to one space and use active voice, that's even better.
Well, I saw quite a few yes, yes, thank yous. My kids told me I needed to only use one space. And then I saw some that said my boss still requires the two.
Yeah,
yeah.
There are some. Yeah.
And one even said if you're under character limitations, one space.
Okay.
It's an extra character.
Yeah.
All right. It looks like some of them are coming in that are that are a little let's see, repetitive of some that we may have already answered. I'm just trying to see if anything is coming through the chat that is different. Amy, please tell me, is there any of these that I've missed?
Nope, I think you're covering everything.
All right. All right. We do have some questions about classes at GSUSA, which we can definitely pull and send those to Sean-Ree for answers. I say we have probably hit it. I think we've gotten I think we've hit all of our questions. Thank you, Heather. We're getting a lot of thank yous. If you want to open your chat, you can see those wonderful thank yous. Okay. You're also probably seeing the thumbs up and the hearts at the bottom.
I am. Thank you, everybody.
Yes, this has been an amazing opportunity for us to meet with you, to really get to know you a little more, and to hear about plain language. This was a fascinating topic. I do appreciate you being here with us. And thank you very much to GSUSA for sponsoring this event series, and Heather for, like I said, coming to talk to us and working there at GSUSA.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Amy and Shanda at the Training Officers Consortium. And thanks also to my colleague, Sean-Ree, for being there to back me up on things I didn't know.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you all. We'll be sending the link to the recording after it is finished downloading and processing.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.